Ready? Well, welcome everyone to this afternoon's deep dive. And for those of you joining online, a very, very big welcome. And just so you know, it's day 2 of the conference and we've just had lunch here at Oxford. So day 2, post-lunch, we've got our work cut out, right? Yes, the time, yeah. But don't you worry, it's not going to be low energy. It's going to be a very invigorating discussion. If not, you're going to all stand up and do star jumps, okay? So you better enjoy it or else. So I'm Chi-Hung Sin, very pleased to be here. I'm an ex-GoLab Fellow of Practice. I call myself friend and family. I'm that weird uncle that comes for every family gathering uninvited, and they can't get rid of me. But honestly, the reason I'm here is because I'm chairing these sorts of panels now for the past 5 conferences that I feel passionately about, which is about international comparisons. That I think we do better work when we bring in different perspectives, that we are more inclusive in the voices we bring to the table, because that helps us hold up a mirror to our own practice, right? Those of you who were here yesterday would have heard me talk about being conscious of the orthodoxies we work within. I think it's through these international comparisons that really show us that it's so important to keep asking those why questions and not just the how do you do it type of questions. And I'm so thrilled to have with me today this wonderfully diverse set of international panelists, carefully curated. So without further ado, to get you introduced to them, and I think I'm going to kick off with Paula. Over to you, Paula, to introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Chi-Hung. So it's lovely to meet everyone. I'm Paola. I'm from Costa Rica, Latin America. And I started learning about outcomes contracting by reading my way through it. Okay. So it all seemed as if everyone had everything, so nicely structured. And this is great. I'm just going to take this back home and I'm going to go ahead and do it. And then I found the Latin American context, okay? So I will be sharing, just as Chi-Hung mentioned, a little bit about Latin America and that journey over there.
Thank you, muchas gracias, Paula. And next up, it's nothing. Next up, we cross the oceans to Portugal, where we have Margarita. Over to you, Margarita.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. My name is Margarita. I'm a partner and director at Maze. Maze is an impact investment company based in Lisbon. We've been working in outcomes-based commissioning for 10 years now. We've structured and done performance management for 5 SIPs in Portugal, and we've recently ventured into the development impact bond world in our Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa. And we've also advised the public sector in Portugal in multiple issues related to this agenda, including on structuring an outcomes fund that was very catalytic for the Portuguese ecosystem.
Obrigado, Margarita.
Nada.
And I think you just at a critical point in potentially launching a project in Angola, is that right? So it'll be fascinating to get some of your reflections on the differences or similarities in practice. Next, short hop over to Turkey, where I'm thrilled to have Mustafa with us for the first time at this conference, I believe. Mustafa?
Thanks for inviting me to this wonderful conference. I learned a lot here and I met really wonderful people. I am Mustafa Karabaş from Istanbul Development Agency. I joined the Turkish public sector in 2001, and since 2010, I have been working for the Istanbul Development Agency. We have been defining the regional priorities and launching some grant programs in order to realize one of those priorities in Istanbul. And since last year, I have been responsible for the first social impact bond project of Turkey. It's called Istanbul Kodluyor, Istanbul is Coding. And I'm responsible for the day-to-day management and monitoring of Istanbul Kodluyor on behalf of the outcome funder.
Teşekkür ederim, Mustafa. But just to say, back to Mustafa, you've just celebrated the first anniversary of that first social impact bond, haven't you?
Yeah.
Congratulations, so exciting. And I know that there are colleagues here from Turkey who's also involved, not just in that impact bond, but in a pipeline of projects that are coming up. So I think Turkey is really interesting to look at. So from Turkey, we move to Israel, where we have Tal. Over to you, Tal.
Hi, nice to be here. I'm a social worker. The first thing I say about myself that I'm a social worker. But along that, I am the team leader of the outcomes team in Brookdale Institution. Brookdale, or MJB, we call it, is the leading applied social research in Israel. We're working mainly with the government and NGOs, mainly. My team mainly worked with the Ministry of Social Affairs, and the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Justice. Those are the big ministries that I'm working with. I will be talking less about achieving outcomes in the social arena, rather measuring it. I really believe deeply and truly that measuring right, profoundly meaningful and practical, okay, also help to achieve social outcomes. So my main focus will be on the challenges and the methodology that we developed in Israel. There is a model that is now widespread in Israel, in the public and in the local authorities regarding outcome planning, monitoring, and measurement.
Thank you. Toda rada, Tal. And last but not least, very, very delighted to have with me a fellow Singaporean, Christopher Gee. Over to you, Chris.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Gee. I'm Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies in Singapore. It's part of the National University of Singapore. Our journey, the Institute's journey on the social impact, social outcome space started coming up to 3 years ago now. We're interested to see how the social outcomes ecosystem develops in Singapore and seeing what we can do to facilitate the growth of this outcomes-focused ecosystem in Singapore. We haven't got a formal role in this space at the moment, apart from the fact that we are at this stage, we've started on a social impact bond on an outcomes amplifier model, working with youth at risk in looking at a job training and placement program. So we just started that off. And we have interesting roles in that. Anyway.
Sure. Thank you so much, Chris. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, our wonderfully diverse set of panelists. So to get us started, because we only have less than 90 minutes now, this is such an expansive topic, so we don't want to bite off more than what we can chew. The title of the deep dive is Disrupting the Narrative, and this is something I'm passionate about, which is about how do we know what we know, right? We work within some of these orthodoxies that set standards. Well, this is what good looks like. This is how you do it. But I'm conscious that this is such an international conference that you and I, from our different perspectives, come at it and go, oops, I thought I knew how to do it. I don't. And actually, there's something this shows up in terms of the limitations of how we come to know what we know or think we know what we know. So I've worked with the panelists and we've settled on these 3 broad hooks to guide today's discussion. The first is, what are the roots of this disruption that people feel? Okay, where are its sources? How is it being experienced? Building on that, what do these non-alignment between your knowledge, your starting knowledge base, your expectations, with your actual experience and what you actually had to do on the ground, what do these open up in terms of the fractures and fissures? What do these look like? And most critically, if we interrogate these fissures and fractures, what new knowledge is generated as a result of that? And what does that mean for our international endeavors of working on all things outcomes? So those are the three hooks for the discussions. And I'm sure we can be here till the cows come home, but let's get started and see how far we can go with this. So I'd like to come perhaps to you first, Paula, because you have such a rich perspective rooted in Latin America, and the conversations we've had. I've always said LATAM is moving so quickly. Every year you're at the conference, you find out something different is happening in the Latin American region. And you work as individual countries and you work as a region. So I think it's so ripe a place in a region for disruptions to occur. So can I trouble you to talk us through some of those?
Sure. First, let's just share a little bit of context regarding Latin America. Okay, so think about, putting like all of the countries in the European Union like in one bag, right? And then that would only be the size of Brazil, right? And where do you leave the rest of the other countries in Latin America that are part of the G20 and they're influencing the discussion? That's huge. So that's just like on a size perspective. Then think about energy transition, right? We need lithium and we need copper, okay? So basically the lithium and the world's reserves of copper and lithium are in Latin America. Think about, Australia has been so successful extracting the lithium. Well, they hold up to 4%. In Latin America, we have more than 60%, okay? And then I can keep on raising all of these other examples regarding just how important Latin America is regarding the Amazonian forest, right? Which people relate to Brazil, but it actually, it requires a coalition of several countries that need to safeguard it. So taking that into account, think about the fact that we are not nations that are unified some way, somehow, or that share common policies, okay? And we've had amazing success stories. We had countries in Latin America that after World War II were more wealthy and more educated than some of the European superpowers that actually won the war. And now they've gone backwards, okay? So yes, it's true. We are diverse. We are incredibly relevant for world sustainability. We're now picking up the bill on food security also. And yes, there's something happening every day, but everything is so different and it is massively contextual. Okay, so I'm going to leave that idea over here, and then I'm going to move it to the lens that I used to see this. And I have a confession to make. I am a lawyer. Okay, I'm a lawyer that has always been a lawyer, enjoys being a lawyer. Feels, when they say lawyer, I'm like, yeah, hi, hello, I'm right here, okay? And that in my context is usually more of or the regulation is usually more of a constraint. Why? Because if we think of the law, right, like I'm gonna, divide this, there's like civil law and common law. So Latin America, civil law. So it's what's written over there, right? It doesn't really shape or adapt unless there is a regulation that's enacted. Okay, so think about, how slow that could be. The other item is that when we're talking about engaging with the government, then, we get into the other two bulks of information in the law, right? So, what relates to the government or public law, it's about, the government can do what's actually written word by word that they can actually do. So going back to what Shihun was saying, right? The law believes they actually state what's right and how you should do it. Okay, it's like 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you missed 4, okay, I'm sorry, you're not going to get the permit or whatever is it that you require. And then you have the other section of the private sector where there is flexibility. So when you start talking about outcomes-based contracting or so on, what has occurred in Latin America is that since there are so many constraints from the governments to actually be able to be flexible and try to do some of the things, what has happened is that governments already have something that might or might not be working, right? Okay, and they need a third party to actually sort of like swallow upon the risk of, understanding just how much is it that they will have to pay in case outcomes are highly successful. And then over there we have two massive sort of like parties over there, and then one of them are family foundations. Family foundations are incredibly wealthy in Latin America. They own portions of countries, portions of countries that are part of the G20. That's how wealthy they are, okay? And the other are foundations that belong to a corporation, okay? And you have countries like the country where I'm from, Costa Rica, right? We actually calculate our GDP with including Intel and without including Intel. So that's just how much they can actually move the needle. So brief wrap up, right? Complex, highly regulated, right? Civil law, the governments, have like a box in which they should act. And then you have all of these other actors, which are the ones that are currently driving and moving on along with the risk. If I were to just wrap this up in one word, right? Well, I'm going to change the word for a phrase my grandmother used to say. I'm going to go first in Spanish. It says, no es lo mismo verla venir que bailar con ella. So it's not the same thing, to see, the idea and the regulation coming to you than actually having to dance with the lady, okay? So dancing Latin America, I think, is kind of appropriate.
I like that because, if people are low energy,
Yes.
you get people up to move.
I got the laptop for the music.
Fantastic. That is such a good intro to it because it just immediately explodes the question, right? It's about that level of variability, but with a certain level of rigidity that you have to comply with, but also different sets of players that we in the UK or Europe may not be used to thinking of as asset holders that we can play into the ecosystem and what's their role. Do they skew the power dynamics, etc.? So I'll come back to you later on that. On this note, Chris, can I come to you because you go from LATAM, where you put all the countries in Europe together in size and it fits into Brazil, to Singapore, where it's one dot on the global map that if you don't squint hard enough, you don't see it necessarily. So Singapore is interesting in that Singapore has always been open to the global influences, but at the same time is a very unique local system, politically, socially, culturally. How are these different motivations and drivers or potential for disruptions playing out in the Singapore context?
We use the opportunity, and certainly from where we stand, we started our journey, as I said earlier, 3 years ago. We've used this time to observe what's gone on around the world, to try and understand, in particular, what the driving forces are in this social outcome, social impact space, but also understanding that in Singapore, we have a huge opportunity to mobilize capital, right? Singapore is an investment hub. And it is a channel for trade flows and for other investment flows. Yeah. So it's an investment hub, right? And might we use the same kind of principles or similar principles to think about social investment? Yeah. And then co-opt, adapt institutions, mechanisms to apply in this space. The observations that we've had indicate that the stakeholders, the funders, the donors still very much act, as we were talking about yesterday in the keynote session, from their own particular perspectives, their own positions, rather than any or much of a shared interest in the actual outcomes, but still protective of their own positioning. And what we would like to understand is how we can sort of move away from acting and working as contracting counterparties to more as partners, where the risk of the enterprise is shared more equally. Yep. So how might we lower the risk or flatten the learning curve? We've learned a lot from conferences such as this. There's a global community, but we have to adapt that, of course, to the local Singapore context. Initiatives like GoLab's Indigo, Sirocco, and just sharing from platforms such as this have been very helpful in terms of getting us up the learning curve. But what more could be done? I mean, I think we talked about, Tal, you talked about measurement, right? What more might be done to develop what we could all agree are generally acceptable social accounting principles? Yeah. Just an example, international accounting standards for financial reporting, right? These came out of the 1930s depression. And by 1973, the International Accounting Standards Council was established. And today, 132 countries around the world accept these accounting principles and financial standards. And that has catalyzed investment flows, financial capital being drawn into enterprises, for-profit enterprises, of course. And you know the size of international capital markets today. So how might we think about the development of similar social accounting principles that could be established? My view is that you might have to start from a local basis first. And just like the accounting profession, right? In each jurisdiction, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales set up their own centers of excellence, and in their own particular clients develop their accounting principles. Similarly, we could have these establish these mechanisms. Yeah. So anyway, I'll stop there.
That's really interesting because the arc of what you just said is about Singapore having to look outwards and then finding what's there, adapting it. So we do have databases like Indigo, etc. They're useful, but they don't give you all the answers. And there's something about also how do you then do it bottom up to connect it with the outside in. So there's this global, local kind of tension being played out in terms of the orthodoxies of knowledge and how it's being applied.
You can call it tension. There's also an opportunity for cooperation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And on this, actually, I'd like to come to you, Mustafa, because lots of work have been taking place, obviously, in LATAM and a lot of thinking in Singapore. You, as we all know, the Turkish ecosystem is very new to this. How does listening to any of this strike you? It's like, as someone quite new to this community of outcomes-based approaches, how have you been navigating where do you go for knowledge about this, about how you do this? What have you realized as you applied those knowledge or toolkits? What worked, what didn't work? What kind of adjustments did you have to make?
Thank you again. Istanbul Kodluyor, Istanbul Coding is our first pilot project, SIP project, and it's our first experience as an outcome founder. At the beginning, since the contract is about reaching predefined outputs by the delivery partner, and then payment by us in return, we were expecting a more formal and a contractual relation with the investor. But it has been a relational contract between us, since both are chasing after the same objective, because we want the investor to be successful in the project, because we are chasing after the same objectives, same outputs. So it has been a trust-based, transparent, fair and constructive relation from the very beginning. Let me first talk about our project. It's about our project, Istanbul Coding, is targeting NEET people, NEET youth. Those are not in education, not in employment, not in training. And those are interested in ICT roles. We have 3 main outputs defined and 2 performance outputs defined. The main outputs were 600 people trained on coding. Then 450 of them employed in the ICT sector, and at least 370 of them sustained their jobs in the ICT sector for at least 6 months. And two, I think these performance indicators are also very important because the first performance indicator is about women promotion in the ICT sector. And the second one is about overperformance. So we were, the target, the total target is 550 people employed, young people employed in the ICT sector. But, and as of today, I want to say that we have, the project has two parts. One is education and the training, education and the coding. The second part is employing them in the ICT sector. And the training part was completed, and now the delivery partner has been focused on the employment part. And as of today, we have reached 100 employments in the ICT sector. So we have nearly succeeded 20% of the total, and we have nearly one more year to go. So I think so far it has been very successful. But during implementation, we faced some challenges that we could not foresee during the design phase. For instance, one of the initial eligibility criteria for the potential applicants was being not in education when applying to the program. But in Turkey, most new graduates without job especially tend to enroll open universities in order to benefit from low discounted transportation tariffs, or especially for the males, for postponing the compulsory military service. So, and besides, it was easy to certify enrollment to a university or graduation from a university by e-government services, but it wasn't easy, and still it isn't, to certify that you are not in education by an barcoded document. Moreover, we also noticed that we forgot some job codes, ICT job codes in the contract. Then, together with the mutual understanding, and thanks to the instruments put in the contract as contract review provisions, we were able to amend the contract. So despite the challenges, we are still on the track. At this point, I want to make an analogy. In Turkish, we have a proverb like her. It's called "Kervan yolda düzülür." Kervan means the caravan, the trade caravans. As you may know, during old days in the deserts of Asia, there were trade caravans consisting of merchants, individuals, sometimes pilgrims, and animals like camels or donkeys for carrying the loads. So those caravans, the final destination, you know the final destination. You are leaving from a certain city and you know the final destination. But during the journey, sometimes during the environment was adaptive, because especially sometimes due to weather conditions. For instance, if it is hot, too hot, they decrease the load capacity of the animals. If it is cold, they increase by including new merchants. Or due to some regional conflicts, they may change the route, but the final destination never changes. It's always there, the final destination. We can you make so they made it up as they go along. They change their route, they change conditions as they go along. There are some principles for the benefit of all, but everyone believes that it will be all right on the night. So to sum up, I just want to say, do not get stuck in the challenges, enjoy the journey.
Thank you. I wonder how does that, it'll be all right on the night sit with government. You know, it sounded almost like you were surprised that the contracts were relational. You were expecting the contract to be more formal, more, more strict. and now you're saying it'll be all right on the night. How is government taking that?
Yeah, you are right. It's not all about flexibility. We are also accountable to public. We are accountable to central government agencies. The Court of Accounts is visiting us every year. So we have used those provisions in the contract. So everything is within the contract, but the provisions in the contract has providing us the flexibility.
Thank you so much.
So flexibility and accountability going together.
Yeah, very important point. But I also love the point you made about even terminology that we think is quite consistent, like NEAT, not in education, employment training. And it was clear to you and your stakeholders when you got going, but when you got going, you realized, oh, hang on a minute, this thing that was so objective that everyone understood what it was actually had to be transformed. So that is also quite a useful revelation. Actually, Chris, you mentioned the importance of evidence and measurement. I'd like to come to you, Tal, because we're talking about disruptions. You are in charge of measurement and evidence, right? Isn't that very objective? Isn't that quite a linear thing?
This is the right thing that I want to talk about, because we're really talking about dialectical engagement between adaptation and having a model, having a right way to go, and we have to adopt. When I was recruited to the position, very highly and respected position of the director of the Outcomes Initiative. That's how it was called. Bear in mind, it was more than 15 years ago, okay? So, and then I thought my main position, my main job would be on the measurement question, okay? What do we measure? How do we, in what method do we measure? At what, when, how frequent? Who will be the source of information? How do we analyze the information in order to gain knowledge and understanding, in order to learn and do better? It was very quick. I mean, quickly. It was no more than a week, I think, in my new position, that I understand that I'm gonna have to reshuffle everything, and like in ways, try to calculate the roots from the beginning. Ways, an Israeli invention. So I knew where I want to get, but I had to do different way in order to get there. The main challenges were that workers, and I mean managers, headquarters, and field workers, really 15 years ago, okay, reluctant to define outcomes. Why am I here for? Okay, more so they were some kind struggling with defining the smart theory, the theory of change. If this is what I want to get, what do I do in order to get there? Also, both managers and field worker thought that measurement, especially when using quantitative tools, is like distrust in their work, disrupting the word, mainly because it seems like the social doing is more of an art than really a structured, professional way. So how can we measure that? It cannot be measured. That was the answer that I got over and over and over again. And also the practical level. In order to do not one every, 5, 10 years evaluation research, but ongoing monitoring, ongoing learning, ongoing measurement, it needs to be practical. It needs to use different tool. It needs to be easy for the field worker that engage with it. It needs to help them, not just I'm putting the data inside. I need to get something back. It helps me professionally. It helps me. I'm sorry. In decision making, prioritizing, even if I'm talking with a small child or a policy agenda. So this is when I'll get there. I will present the model. And the model is really based on the understanding that the climate, the culture, the resistance of measurement is a critical aspect in outcome measurement. And we cannot put it aside, okay? We must acknowledge that. We must understand it. We must acknowledge what we can measure and what we cannot, because I don't agree with the saying everything is measurable. No, I don't think everything is measurable. But we can still measure lots of things. And measuring will do best practice and will help us to achieve social outcomes. So I will get there.
Thanks, Tal. I think what you've raised in your contribution there is that even the things that we think of as being very objective and technical, like measurement, is actually deeply a relational exercise.
Very relational, you need to adapt. We have a model, and yet every project that me and my team are dealing is like learning the language, learning the objection, learning the opportunities that there is, acknowledging that it's not so obvious, even 15, maybe 20 years after, it's not so obvious that it is important to define outcomes. I'm not talking about measurement, define them, defining the theory of change. And it's like, sometimes it's feel like, oh, again, and I feel so, like a broken record, saying the old stuff again and again. But it needed to be, and when I'm teaching my stuff, I said, okay, they're new. You did it already like 10 times. They're new to these ideas and to this knowledge. So yeah, we start again. And one thing I should mention, we have in Hebrew say, I think the translation is walk the talk. You use this, okay? So me and my staff and my colleagues are doing the same. We always try to measure ourselves, our outcomes in applying outcome thinking and practice outcomes measurement. And if I read things that I wrote like 10 years ago, I say, oh my God, what did I think to myself? Okay, we have to learn again and again and to change accordingly because it's rational and it changed from the environment and the political aspect, which in Israel, we're struggling, and on again.
Thank you so much. So yeah, the data enterprise is not linear, it's iterative. You can go backwards and do loops all the time.
Yeah.
Now coming to Margarita then, because you've got so much experience in these sorts of outcomes-based instruments, not just in Portugal, but now starting to work in Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa. Looking at the Indigo database, I think there are, 23 impact bonds in Portugal? So that's a very mature kind of outcomes-based project ecosystem. Surely you've got everything sussed out. Everything is very clear as to what the standards are, how you do this, how to sustain it. What are your reflections on that?
We've done it. No, I'm kidding. Yes, so I think it's interesting because I was listening to Mustafa and to Tal, and there's so much that I identify with in our experience in Portugal, even though it's been almost 10 years since the first SIB, and we've done a bunch. Well, 23 is not a lot, but in the European space, it's still a good number. And yet, in a way or another, we always struggle with the same things. And so I would say that our experience with OBC in Portugal has been what the literature told us it would be in many ways, in the good things that these contracts brought to the people that were involved in them. I thought it was interesting, Mustafa's point on the relational aspect, because we felt from the intermediary and kind of investor standpoint the same, that it was interesting that the public sector agreed to come into these social impact bond contracts, but it took a while for the culture of working to change. So even though we were in an outcomes contract, the idea that we were collaborating and that the public sector was not policing the way activities were being enacted, this took a while to to take hold. So I thought that was quite interesting. I think there are two things that we're still struggling with, and that we keep looking outside of Portugal to try to understand how other people are dealing with it. So the first thing is, I think we're struggling with outcomes-linked financing or outcomes practice not being a niche thing. So even though it's a relatively successful niche thing in Portugal, it's still not really a part of how the public sector, which is very critical in the social space in Portugal. It's a very socialist country in the sense of how the social protection is organized. This is still a niche thing. Even within public sector, the part of public sector that does outcomes-based commissioning is not really talking as much as we would hope with everything else that is going on in public sector. So that's a challenge that we're facing. And as a little bit of a spoiler, we can go into it a bit deeper later, the Portuguese public sector mobilized European funding to pay for outcomes. That was very powerful. That's also the reason we have so many contracts. The downside of that is that has kind of a separate logic to everything else that is funded by the public sector. So it doesn't really encourage these things to become cohesive. And then the second challenge that we've faced, and I think it was you, Chi, that made that provocation in the previous session in this room, is I think very naively, a lot of the parties that were involved in the beginning of this movement in Portugal, we thought, okay, if we design these contracts well, if we really do the work on defining the outcomes, how they're going to be measured, and then the outcomes are met, surely something is going to happen afterwards. Like surely the public sector with all this evidence is going to, pick it up, contract these providers long-term. Of course, it was, and as I'm sure everyone in this room that has worked in this space knows, that's not at all what happened. And so coming up with good exit strategies, keeping the public sector engaged and committed to these contracts through, government changes, economic fluctuations, it's really challenging. And we've had some instances of projects that went really well, and we got to the end, the outcomes were met. The providers are like, okay, we pulled through. We grew so much this process, what now? And in some of these cases, you're essentially starting from scratch. So I'm very excited to learn from everyone else on how to handle these.
I think that's such a powerful point that, we, back to Tina's keynote yesterday about clocks and clouds, right? It's like we think to operationalize these sorts of instruments, it's the measurement, which is linear, it's objective, and this is what you mean by success and what is needed to demonstrate success. If you've got all this evidence and the outcomes are achieved at a certain level, it would have made its case, it would sustain, you would want to go on. And despite what the written codified information tells us, the reality can be quite different. There's this art that goes on around the science of the contracts, of the evidence, etc. And I think what you guys have talked about so far is the disruptions. It sounds to me comes when you're trying to bring the global into the local and trying to connect the local back out to the global in terms of that knowledge exchange and that knowledge codification. But it's also in navigating this balance between the technical and the relational. And there's no codified text anywhere that tells you how to do it and what's the balance in different contexts. Can I come to maybe the audience or Harry for some online reflections? Maybe just taking one or two quick questions. I'm conscious of the time. Shafak?
Thank you. This is Shafak Müderriskit from Turkey. My question is to Margarita. Speaking of disruptions, I always thought that Portugal had done a great job. And in 10 years, you have done 23 outcomes contracts. and congratulations for that. But you're saying that it's still not mainstreaming, but it's a niche area. And in these 10 years, this decade, last decade, how many times did the government actors change? Was this a factor for you to, was this a factor for disruption?
Mm-hmm.
So before I come to you, anyone from the chat with any comments or questions?
Okay, so we do have one online, and it's more of a comment, and it says, see, this is from Faith Abiola Ellison, who says, seems like the pursuit of outcomes are necessary but not sufficient for the securing mainstreaming of projects.
Great. So I'll respond to that comment later, but I'd like to invite Margarita to respond to Shafak's question, please.
Sure. Well, from my limited perspective, I don't represent the public sector. They would know much better how to answer that. But so I think the changes in government, if I'm not mistaken, there have been 2, including changes in political colors. And I think a good thing so Portugal has an outcomes fund which paid for the outcomes in 22 out of these 23 SIPs. So it's very critical for the existence of these SIPs. The fact that this outcomes fund exists and mobilizes European funding and is aligned with the timing of European funds protected it in a way from political changes. So that was a good thing of mobilizing that money and building it in that way. I think the effect of political changes was this fund has a team that was kind of been mobilized from civil servants to operate this machine. They do other stuff. They do capacity building and really interesting stuff around the outcomes fund. I think what happens is they have the very difficult job of getting the ministries that are linked to the areas where the fund pays for outcomes, which so health, employment, education, interested in it. And they try to get those ministries to make soft commitments to do something with these results. So I think what was difficult for them is that they invested a lot of time in building these relationships in the ministries that were highly dependent on political cycles, but also highly dependent on how much political backing they had. So there was a period where they answered to a minister that really believed in this agenda, and that basically shoved them into the throats of a lot of important ministers. And then that changed, and they basically became very helpless in getting access to these players. So that was very critical. And then I would say, from a very comfortable place of not being a civil servant, that maybe something that could have been different, or for another country that is thinking about doing the same, particularly in the European context, is if there was some sort of co-commitment from ministerial budgets, even if it was small, the capacity to keep the people from these ministries interested in what's going on in the project might have been very difficult, because basically you have outcomes contracts running in health, in employment, with no money from these ministerial budgets. So very easy to say, it looks amazing, but really paying attention and being consequential, it changes when we have money involved, as we all know. That's why we're here, right? So those would be my comments on that.
Yeah, you need to have skin in the game.
Exactly.
What a lot of us say here. And just quickly responding to the online comment, it just reminds me that one of the things I always say to people in the comment was outcomes are necessary but not sufficient. What I always say to people is when we do outcomes based work, it's not the attention so much of the time is on the outcomes for the target beneficiary groups. But what I always say about whether these things stick or have legs or go further is that you need to also design it with what are the outcomes for the system, what are the outcomes for the decision makers. If you just stay at outcomes as being those that are manifested for the service beneficiaries, they don't answer all the exam questions. So as my personal reflection is, as you do outcomes contracts, think about different levels of outcomes. Outcomes for the beneficiary, but outcomes for the decision makers, the system. I'm very conscious of time, and I'm going to encourage my panelists to be concise in their contributions. But I'd like to come back to you, Chris, because one of the things that we quite often encounter in applying our knowledge is this global, local fissure that is both attention, but as you say quite rightly, opens up opportunities. What are some of your thinking around how we might take steps to reconcile that?
So I think there's a need for some linking infrastructure. That might, be in the form of sort of universal protocols. Right? Again, I'm going to use an example, a real-world example of the establishment of the World Wide Web on top of the internet. Yeah, it was kicked off by the establishment of protocols like the domain name scheme or DNS, hypertext transfer protocol, right? HTTP, HTML, all of that. These are all sort of protocols that allow us to link up initiatives from all over the world, right? If we think about that within our space, what are the connecting points between the highest levels and the local level? Linking the individual outcomes to the program level outcomes to the systemic level outcomes. Have some mechanism for that. We need agents, we need actors that do this linking job, right? And again, present at this conference, I've already met quite a number of people that act in this way, yeah? But how do we professionalize this group, this occupation, right? Such that just like we have with the Institute of Chartered Accountants, it becomes a recognized profession that supports this. And it also needs, I would say, investment, right? So as funders, as stakeholders, we think a lot about the program level outcomes. We want all the money as much as possible to be funding those outcomes. But we also need to be recognizing the fact that we need to properly resource the system level outcomes that we desire, which might be the development of this intermediate infrastructure, this linking infrastructure.
I think it's really interesting reflecting on that point, because in other sessions from yesterday and today, there have been debates about actually who holds it together. Should it be in government? Should it be in intermediaries? And you're talking of just a looser concept of a linking infrastructure with different actors. Those actors are not predetermined. It could be probably context specific as to what would hold that information, that knowledge, transfer it, but also link the local and the global. On that note, I'd like to come to Paula, because I know in the Latin American ways of working in the different countries in the region, you quite often have very visible and active communities of practice, right, to help you make sense of things in a region and a country perspective. What are some of your reflections on some of those experiences?
Well, if we think about the two factors that I was sharing regarding Latin America a little bit earlier, right? The fact that it is so big and so contextual, and that government is highly constrained, and that it has been private actors such as corporate foundations or family foundations, the ones that have built on this, then the approach, or sort of like the overall constructing or building on those instruments, or acting as that intermediary that Christopher was mentioning on, has heavily relied on that private sector or philanthropy sector, okay? And that, I think it's important to just remember that for all of the comments that I will keep on sort of like sharing with you right now throughout this intervention, because I am intentionally cutting out, in a way, government, right? Because, and I'm not from the, let's say, outcomes measurement or outcomes payment, because we are keeping in Latin America government involved, but government can do what they will allocate their budget to what they need to do, right? They want to pay the lowest price possible, right, for a specific public service that they need to deliver. Okay, so they will be engaged, of course, because they will pay for that base cost structure, of the third party that will perhaps train people for employment or do something else. Okay, so that's very, very, very important to remember. Why? Because where innovation is occurring regarding what you were sharing, regarding how outcomes are measured, what you were sharing about, well, it's okay, it's the private sector, so I was gonna take this route, but I can take that other, right? My camel will will take it. That America will be horses, but yeah, that's something that will occur. And since we different than Portugal, we don't have funds from the Latin American Union, or they're planning to experiment on anything. So it is this private sector, right, the one that has been innovating and doing all of those things. So to ground it, right, regarding what you were mentioning, it lies on the private sector. And the private sector has a different, or can have a different approach of bringing these two worlds together, what you were asking very specifically, right? And it is about how all of these good standards that we might create if we follow Chris's approach of having like the ISSB for outcomes-based contracting, right? Or all these types of sort of like capacity builders. Then we can just let the private sector decide on what's a good sort of like a starting point for those. Okay, so if I take that into account, what's going on is that there's a lot of innovation, right, regarding how that's being measured, what is considered a positive outcome, how can we have a systemic approach. But it is not because we do not share the same challenges that you were sharing, but it's because somehow the way this has moved on in Latin America has carved out the government in a very safe spot. Okay. And this is where I come in with this term that I shared with Chihun, and that I've been sharing with the people that I've met across the conference about mandatory self-regulation. Okay, and it's mandatory self-regulation. It's basically, it is not the government, right, regulating something or saying, this is how I will contract. It is the private sector, and yes, they are not the government, they can just not impose it on you. But if you don't comply with what the private sector that's financing this believes is a good idea, then you will probably not get the funds, okay? So that's, I would say, like on a sort of like a wrap up, right? How we are like bringing those two like very formal world and very informal world together in the Latin American context.
I think that's fascinating, because that reminds me of the things I know or hear about going on in parts of South Asia, where the government is bracketed off on one side and are uninvolved in a lot of these types of instruments, and the private sector basically leading it. And that seems to me, you're working the levers that need to be worked on in order to get it going. But doesn't it just like kind of reproduce some of those relational biases? And so, Chris, can I come back to you just very quickly on that point? Given what you were wanting to say about those kinds of linking infrastructure, and building on Paula's point about, if this one doesn't work, we'll put them to one side and we'll work with that. How do those linking infrastructures reproduce or challenge some of those, vested interests or those power dynamics?
Yeah, if you link the ground with the macro level, high level objectives somehow, you democratize, you change the power dynamics in that enterprise quite significantly, do you not? Yeah, you make the link which is necessary from the highest level to the ground. But from the ground, you start hearing the stories, right? Again, throughout this conference, we've already, been talking about how we link the human side of this, right? The personal stories, the personal data with the overall outcomes that we're hoping to achieve. So that getting that linking infrastructure is important. It will reshape the power dynamics that you see. Paula, you talked about the private sector as if they will act in a very benign, benevolent way. If all they do is, adopt the same control and power that the state would otherwise be, other actors would, all you're doing is you're replicating the same asymmetries of power, asymmetries of risk distribution, and the same behaviors that affect normal traditional public sector delivery will also pertain, right? So how do we move away from that? My view is, again, build those, right? And it's case by case, it has to be built on the ground, but hard yards need to be done. Yeah, sorry.
Actually, this linking from bottom to the top reminds me to come to you, Tal, because I think that's exactly what you're trying to do, right? In Israel, about linking from the bottom up to some strategic priorities.
And across population, across social problem. Yeah.
Can you take like 2 minutes to talk us through that?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, really briefly. Our outcomes is that they will not need us, the measurement people, okay? In order to achieve that, we need to build the self-capacity, and we need to do it in a very pragmatic way. One of the things that we're deeply and strongly working on in the last few years is the shared measurement perspective. I will just say a few more. Like everyone in this room, we know in Israel, many programs, many initiatives, many NGOs, many of them are really aimed to achieve the same thing, targeting the same population, even using the same strategy in order to achieve those. And doing this outcomes research and another, it's not practical, it's time consuming, it's budget consuming, it's not right to do so. So we're developing the share measurement approach, which means that, let's say, I will take an example and then that will be simple. Children and youth at risk, okay? It doesn't matter if it is matter, of course, but if it's out of home placement or program in the community, if it's for small children or youth and adolescent, I will always try to measure the seventh right. I'm sorry. We built it upon the Children Rights Convention. Okay, family, peers, emotional well-being, academic achievement. Okay, so in every program, in every initiative, in every public infrastructure, we will try to understand how is the child doing according to the intervention that he got in those 7 areas of life, okay? And we can also imply it in across population, okay? Elderly. We're asking about lonely elderly, but lonely children in loneliness, okay? So we try to create a shared measurement. Of course, the specific indicators are different. If it's a small child and I'm asking for risk behavior, I will ask about running from home and encountering danger at the house and so on and so on. And in adolescent, it would be drug abuse, substance abuse, gambling, dealing with the law enforcement, okay? Also in the community, I will ask about attending school and all kind of things, out of home placement. I will ask for other things. The indicators are different, okay? The source of information might be different. Is it the social worker, the teacher, the child himself? We're using self-report tools very much. I really believe in that. And so this is part of the thing that we're trying now to develop. We did greatly with children and youth, domestic family, not so much in people with disability. We're still struggling in this area, but this is the goal. This is the vision.
Great,
That
thank you. I think that gives the social flavor to your World Wide Web protocol example, didn't it? It's about there are shared outcomes domains that are agreed, but the KPIs, the indicators are flexible, but they respond to the local needs, the local issues, the local populations, but link them up in a more logical chain that makes sense to people. But presumably that requires technology.
Yeah, that's it. And this is the main challenge, even though Israel is a startup nation, you know, but still we're struggling because we don't want it to be outside the organization. So part of our mission is to develop the technological infrastructure in order to build the outcomes measurement, which is not only outcome and not only measurement. The remark from the audience, we want to seek the quality of care, okay? The ethical aspects, okay? We're not dealing only on the outcome. Did he drop from school or went to the university? So we need the technical, so part of our group, part of our stakeholder are people that are, this is their specialty, building this technology, which is part of the ongoing casework file, okay? And the outcome measurement, as I said before, it's not once every few years, it's an ongoing, mainly twice a year, but sometimes even more often. So the data is gathering, and at the end of it, they can do it by themselves, not only the building of the computer system, but the output, the reports. And each rank, each level needs different kind of report in order to help them in their work. So this is a large part of what we are building now in Israel, the technological. Also, just one more sentence. In these days, like 3-4 years, we start engaging in machine learning, okay? Using administrative data that are already there, just pick them and try to understand and achieve actually monitoring a policy. If you want to locate child abuse or even risk for life for small children, how many times did he get to the hospital? I'm sorry, what hospital? Is it close to the house, or is it far? Did they have the police? The data are there. All we need is only to collect them and cluster and try to see if we can find connection. And we're doing it now. It's super exciting, super difficult. Government, all kind of struggling, but I think we're ahead.
Thank you. So that you say you're quite new on that journey, which is interesting. Margaret,
On the civil area.
yes, yeah. So Margarita, can I come to you because obviously, you know, this whole data outcomes data enterprise has been going on for much longer in Portugal. What does it look like in terms of the practice and the capacity for data, for digitalization, for technology, for outcomes?
So I think, and I was talking to Benoit from Tico in the break about this. I think a good thing that we saw coming out of the SIBs that we've been involved in is one of the upsides of doing the SIB that maybe we underestimated the power of that was the capacity that was built in the providers because of the context of the SIB, because the SIB kind of forced everyone to get the proper data infrastructure systems in place, to get proper case management tools. And what we've seen in the 5 providers we've worked with, one of them was already very sophisticated before in this regard, but the other 4 is that the SIB dramatically changed the way they worked and the way they managed their data, and that is still going on, including for SIBs that ended in 2008, 2018, 2019. So that's incredibly powerful. So bridging to that, and I think to what you guys were talking about before, which is, okay, what can we do in this space besides hoping that the public sector really wants this to happen and keeps pushing for it? I think these organizations that participated in the SIBs in Portugal were an exception, or became an exception. So most of the providers addressing social issues in Portugal are nonprofits, and they are, as I'm sure is the case in most other countries, undercapitalized, under-resourced, really struggle in the fight for talent. And so they don't really have the infrastructure to, in most cases, to properly monitor their own outcomes. And by the way, outcomes is already like very high. In a lot of cases, they don't have the infrastructure to monitor their own activities, not just outcomes, which essentially makes setting up any kind of outcome-linked contract, not just SIBs, extremely expensive and disruptive for these organizations, because you always have the cost of kind of setting this all up from scratch. So they're not using case management tools. A lot of their activity tracking sucks up hours and hours of teams that should be doing groundwork. And it's really shocking, like the amount of manual, machine-worthy work that very capable humans are spending a lot of hours doing. And they usually don't have a track record of outcomes that they've achieved. So what we've been pushing a lot for, and we've done this with some success, is, and foundations, for example, our experience is that they're often happy to jump on this, is we've used acceleration models that Maze has used for working with startups, with impact ventures that are, raising equity and everything, to accelerate the digital transition of not-for-profit organizations, basically subsidized by foundations. And we really believe that this is a long-term investment it goes beyond that, but it's definitely a long-term investment for a more strategic outcomes agenda for the public sector, because when that day comes, if that day comes, because with public sector, our experience is that public sector is essential. In Portugal, certainly, is that nothing moves, and then something moves very fast, and then it stops. You are very, you need to take advantage of when it opens, right? And while that doesn't happen, so while you're waiting, you can do this work that doesn't need to depend on the public sector to get the infrastructure in place, so that when that opportunity opens, you're in a much better position to take advantage of it. So we want to do more and more of this work. Also, just feeling the outcomes of that is very rewarding professionally in a profession that sometimes is very frustrating. So yeah.
That's so fascinating. I think all of us can relate to that opportunism point, right? There's no linearity in how we get the ecosystem moving. And I think I'd like to come back to you, Paola, because what you were talking earlier, which I'd like to hear a bit more about, how does a self-regulation work, right? You're trying to bring in a lever from the private sector. Maybe it's as what Margarita was saying, if those opportunities in government aren't there yet, do something else with other people to lay some foundations. And maybe that's what you're talking about in your self-regulation thesis. Can you talk me through a bit more about that?
Well, yes, it is about still having the basis and the guiding points, right, in order for a process to be executed in an appropriate way with the appropriate gatekeepers. But the reason why I keep on talking about it is, again, because of the way the OBC community in Latin America has developed, where we have placed the government in that very specific sector. But I want to just go back a few comments ago and just remind everyone just that, what everyone has shared over here, right, it's how they have managed to move along OBC to get to that in their specific countries and contexts, to get to that ultimate goal, right, of delivering good, right? And in Latin America, that ultimate goal of delivering that good, being it OBC or not being it OBC, has always been regarding this heavy involvement from the private sector and foundations and concessional capital and grants, because of the context that we utilize. And then there's another thing that I want to share regarding government in order to build on this argument in the context of Latin America. And it leads back to a conversation that they were having yesterday over here regarding trust. How can outcomes-based contracts bring back trust, right, from the public sector. And when I've ever traveled to Europe or a country, right, where the taxes that the citizens pay are well executed, I'm like, okay, so they probably think that each time they're paying their taxes, right, they're sort of like, just paying for a service, right? If you ask the average Latin American, I see a few over here, we're just like, I'm giving these people this money, right? This is about, you name it, right? Corruption, poor execution, and anything that's sort of like, that's actually one of the highest on a social perspective. One of the things why people avoid taxes constantly in Latin America is because you don't feel you're getting anything for what you're paying. So why am I going to pay if this is not going to give anything back to me? Okay, so keeping that thought over there, right? We have evolved into, okay, so we trust the private sector to lead into this. And then going back to what Christopher was saying, we cannot just think that the private sector is going to be, like a nice, good boy or girl, and they are just going to do good. We still need some certain standards. So with the concept of mandatory self-regulation, what has happened is that private sector looks into what's being done in other global north countries. That's a nice standard, okay? Think about sustainability accounting and ISSB Sustainability 1 and Sustainability 2, right? So we didn't come up with our own idea, right? We decided to follow the world lead, right? And the first ones that started implementing this, that started, self-regulating themselves, were companies, just because they wanted to showcase a transparent standard on this. And that's also what's occurring with outcomes-based contracting. So it is that private sector that's taking those impact measurements, the good ideas, right, about how the private sector is doing it well, swallowing in the risk, taking those, I'm going to call them global north-driven standards, and let's say, regulating automatically what is it that they are doing. I'm just going to wrap up with one additional idea, and it is that the whole issue around political instability, right, in Latin America is large, is huge, and it has been like that for just so many years. So that has also encouraged this whole distrust in the government actually following up on something, trusting that the private sector will do it. And then the one that I'm proposing, that is the private sector is not it's not going to save the world. It does need guidelines by self-regulating themselves to these good standards.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. And I really think that is challenge. That's a provocation. That's so challenging for a lot of us used to our own ways of working and what we think good is, who's a good partner, right? And what you're really challenging here is just this disruption in action now. I know that people are feeling things when we're talking about let the private sector lead, let self-regulation work. But again, it's a pragmatic response in relation to a very specific set of contextual factors. And certainly, I raise my hand. We don't often hear of people saying regulation is a good thing for, it's an enabler rather than a barrier in the outcome
I need to share this phrase right now. I know regulation and law, I know legal is not sexy, but you cannot be sexy without legal. Okay, you can't. It's impossible, right? If there's a law or a directive that says you cannot do it, you cannot do it, right?
Listen, Mara said yesterday, anyone in OBC is sexy, okay? We're too sexy for our own good. That's why it ain't happening. But, so a counterbalancing argument, perhaps from Turkey, where you're new to this, and I think you're coming against the usual regulatory roadblocks and other kinds of system rigidities. And it's interesting that you come from the investment agency. Can you talk us through how you're navigating some of those system barriers and playing in your role as a development agency in trying to unblock some of those barriers?
Yeah, sure. In this regard, I would like to underline 3 points. As you mentioned, the characteristics of the outcome funder and the approach of the policymaker is very crucial. As you know, the budgets of impact investing projects are usually for 2 or 3 years. So it's hard to fund SIP projects, SIP contracts by the classical public bodies with annual budgets, and with the classical public bodies with longer decision-making processes. But in Turkey, development agencies are a little bit different. That we can call them as semi-autonomous bodies, because the organization is different. We are managed by public-private partnership, and we are the Ministry of Industry and Technology is coordinating the agencies, but all agencies have their own agenda, have their own management. So it's kind of, and we are, when compared to big ministries or other central bodies, we are small. So we have ability to act faster, and we can have multi-annual budgets. So this makes difference. The second thing is the presence of a sample contract is very important. At the very beginning, the most crucial thing was the absence of it. And here I would like to thank to Bridges for their great support in this regard, because they are not just, they didn't just bring money. They brought smart money. I mean, they came with their knowledge base, they came with their international expertise, they came with their networks. So thank you, Liz. And I would like also thank to Şafak Hanım from ETKİAP. ETKİAP is a national regional NGO working on impact investing ecosystem. And Can Bey is now providing consultancy to our investor, and he's on his way to his flight. Thanks to them for their great efforts, because they acted like really intermediaries, because they both know the impact investing topic very well, and they know the Turkish ecosystem, Turkish administrative and legal system very well. So yesterday we talked about adaptation is very important in cloud setting. So in this regard, Şafak Hanım, Can Bey, their teams, and Bridge teams, they played really very crucial role in adapting the English version of the contract to the Turkish legal system. So this is very important. But I think from now on, we have a contract, but we have that contract also lacking some issues maybe. So with the experiences we gained in this first pilot project, we need to update this contract, the sample contract, and we are a semi-autonomous body, but we need to also scale these contracts to the other bodies, like foundations, like other central government bodies. So we need to have maybe different kinds of sample contracts that complies with the, how can I say, legal provisions of those institutions. So we need to enhance, develop this sample contract, and the functioning of the presence of a functioning SIP is very, as a local sample, inspires others. Now, all eyes are on us in Turkey. All other 25 development agencies. I have been receiving so many questions from so many different regional agencies every day. 2 or 3 weeks ago, we hosted the mayor of Gaziantep. She was one of the previous ministers of family. She was interested in launching a SIB in his city, in her city. So all I saw, we are getting so much attraction from others. And the ministry, I also would like to thank to the ministry for their visionary leadership. The current minister is very enthusiastic about impact investing. As my colleague said, I don't know what happens next if the ministers change even within the same government. But in that regard, in that context, I think the intermediary bodies like ETKİAP or like national impact investing advisory bodies, they play important role in increasing the awareness of this issue and ensuring that this issue is always on the agenda of the politicians. So those kind of intermediary bodies are really very important for the sustainability of the ecosystem.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. I'm very conscious of time. And, you know, the best planned chairing just went to pot. I'm sorry. But I want to take a few questions from this very, very rich and provocative, you know, discussion. Anyone online or in the audience with a question or observation or comment? Yeah, Tina. Hang on. Yes, please, because the people online won't be able to hear you otherwise.
Thank you. Thank you. So I believe in collaboration, but I also believe in rocking the boat. So I want to ask a challenging question here. And I will confess upfront that I'm new to the world of outcome-based contracting. So full ignorance on display right now. So implicit in a lot of this conversation is criticism of the public sector, right? As the public sector has failed to produce its outcomes. But I have to ask, should we have that much more trust and faith in the private sector? I mean, isn't part of our challenge in society, private sector doesn't want to pay livable wages, thus we have poverty. Private sector doesn't want to give out benefits, therefore we have challenges with healthcare all around the world. The private sector is a polluter, right? And we have now air quality, water quality, all sorts of challenges. So, I mean, is the private sector that much better? Should we be that much more positive or optimistic about its ability to produce these outcomes in the public sector? And I would also, well, I think it's really interesting and I love the kind of normative idea of self-regulation. I would ask, in what area of the private sector has self-regulation worked, right? I can't think of a single one, whether that's technology, environmental, production, manufacturing. Implicit in the private sector is, you know, they want to deregulate so they can do whatever they want, which just produces more bad outcomes that government then has to ask. So implicit in this conversation, I think, are some assumptions that we should really be challenging and examining. And I think, you know, some of them are ideological and some of them are part of this broader narrative about government bashing and bureaucracy bashing and the failure of the public service, which I admittedly am a public service fanatic, but I don't necessarily buy it. So
Love that challenge. Raise my hand up. No, don't apologize. I'm so delighted because this is disrupting, right? This is all about disrupting the narrative. I don't like it when everyone comes to an international conference and everyone says, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, let's all do that. Let's all do that. Let's all do that this way. There are some very different views being expressed here, right? And I think it's great to shine a light on those differences in views. But just to be fair, I think especially from the Turkish and Israeli and Singapore perspective, I think there's quite a strong faith in actually the public, driving that.
Comes from the public sector.
Yeah, sure. So Paula, can I hand it over to you to respond quickly to that?
Yeah, no, sure. I love your perspective, but it leads me back to thinking about what you were saying on your keynote speech. Okay, so the argument that or not an argument, or the idea that I've tried to share regarding Latin America is not that self-regulation is the best idea, or that the public sector or the third sector, for even the fourth is better positioned than government or not. Is that since there's such a huge void, okay, a historical, like the Grand Canyon, like void, out of government not doing anything, then this other option has emerged in that specific context. So my argument went more to the fact that context, and that's, if this is what I've been sharing with Shihun, largely, is that context matters so much to understand, how we're not going to be able to just move the cloud, but at least like right. So that's where I was going with that. And I again also agree, the good practices that the private sector has established have not been the most positive ones. Okay, but there are some good examples, on how that has managed to work. But
Thank you. I'm sure the conversation will continue after this, but I think it just gives you that rich flavor for how different people are working in very different normative and legitimizing environments, right? You hear the whole span of the different interest groups and actors that have a role in this. Are they here in the conference? I'm not sure they all are. So I would really love this conference to keep growing in terms of bringing those voices, those actors. Otherwise, we are telling ourselves the same things that we've been reading about, and we lapse into these orthodoxies. It's not that one is better than the other. It's really about challenging that why question. And on that note, please join me in thanking the wonderful panelists. And not forgetting the amazing GoLab team that have worked so tirelessly. The AV people, the sound people, we love you. Thank you so much, everyone. And continue for coffee and the conversations outside. Thank you so much.